So today, we're going to break down a really fascinating formal argument. It's all about two of the world's most influential books, the Torah and the Quran. Now look, our goal here isn't to pick a side. It's simply to unpack the logic of this specific argument step by step, just to see how it's built and why it's put together the way it is.
And really, it all kicks off with this question right here. This is the puzzle at the very heart of what we're about to explore. I mean, what does happen when foundational texts seem to tell the same story, but with these crucial, key differences? It's a question that really forces you to look closely at the details.
All right, so let's dive in. Any solid, logical argument can't just pop up out of thin air, right? It needs a starting point, a common ground. It needs a set of shared assumptions, or what we call premises, that it can build on. This is the foundation for the entire thing. So, the first building block of this argument, premise number one, is a historical claim. It argues that back in the time of Muhammad, the Torah was widely seen as a trustworthy source for all those stories about the ancient prophets. This is the first key idea the argument asks us to accept.
Okay, so building right on top of that, we get to premise two. This is where the argument connects the dots between the two texts. It claims that the Quran itself actually confirms that the Torah is reliable when it comes to these very same prophet stories. So, a crucial link is established. One text is said to vouch for the other.
So with that foundation laid, the argument now pivots to its central problem. If one text says the other is reliable, what happens when their stories seem to go in different directions on some major details? This is where the argument really introduces its core tension.
And hey, before we go any further, let's get super clear on what this argument means by contradiction. In logic, it's when you have two statements that are so opposed to each other, they just cannot both be true at the same time. Like saying it's raining and it's not raining about the same spot at the same time. It's a basic concept, but it's the engine driving this entire argument.
And that brings us right to the heart of the matter, premise number three. The argument's big claim is that when you put the prophet stories from the Torah and the Quran side by side, you start to see these clear contradictions. We're not just talking about different writing styles or leaving a few things out. We're talking about what the argument frames as totally opposing facts.
Now, the argument doesn't just make this big claim and walk away, right? No, it offers up some specific examples. So let's look at its analysis of one of the most famous shared stories to see how it makes its point, the story of Joseph.
Okay, first up, Jacob's reaction. The source points out that in the Torah, Jacob is completely fooled by the evidence and mourns for years, absolutely convinced his son is dead. But in the Quran's account, it says he immediately sees through the lie and holds on to the belief that Joseph is still alive. These are presented as two totally different, opposite reactions to the very same event.
All right, next up, let's talk about Joseph's age. The Torah is very specific, 17 years old. But the argument claims the Quran's description makes him out to be a much younger child. I mean, a teenager versus a little kid, that's a pretty huge difference that totally changes the context of everything that happens next.
And then there's the timeline. How long did all of this take to happen? The source argues that the Torah's story unfolds over several days, but in the Quran's version, it seems to squeeze all those events into just a single day. So you have one story stretched out over time and another that happens in a flash.
And for the last example from Joseph's story, we've got Potiphar, the Egyptian official. In the Torah, he sides with his wife and throws Joseph in prison. But in the Quran, the source says he sees his wife's guilt and believes Joseph is innocent. It's presented as a complete 180 on who's innocent and who's guilty.
Okay, and this is a really important move the argument makes. It insists that the story of Joseph isn't some unique, isolated case. Its fifth premise is that these kinds of contradictions are all over the place, popping up in other shared stories, like those of Noah and Job. This is a critical step, because it's suggesting that this is a consistent pattern of divergence, not just a one-off thing.
All right, so we've seen the building blocks, the premises, and we've looked at the evidence the argument uses from its case study. Now let's see how the source puts all these pieces together to reach its final logical conclusion. This is where it all leads.
So let's break down these last few steps, piece by piece. Premise 6 is that basic rule of logic we talked about. If two stories contradict each other, they can't both be 100% true. Then, premise 7 just restates that core problem. The Quran supposedly confirms the Torah is reliable, but then it also contradicts it. According to the argument's logic, these two steps lead directly to one and only one conclusion.
And that all leads to this.
the stated conclusion of the source argument. The Torah and the Quran cannot both be the Word of God. Now, it's really important to get that within the framework of this specific argument. This isn't presented as just an opinion. It's framed as the inevitable, logical outcome if you accept all the previous steps we've just walked through.
So after breaking all that down, we're left with a much bigger, more fascinating question, aren't we? We've just examined one specific formal argument, but it opens up this whole complex world of study. How do different theological traditions, different scholars, deal with apparent contradictions within and between their most sacred texts? It's a question that really gets to the heart of interpretation, history, and faith itself.